everyone, and welcome to our TED Talk, where we will be discussing with our friend Jonathan Marks about his book, Tale of the X-Apes, which he wrote in 2015 during his leave while in Notre Dame.
Thank you very much for having me today.
Of course. So can you tell me a brief summary about who you are and your accomplishments?
Okay. My name is Jonathan Marks. I'm a professor of biological anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So, I have worked in genetics and anthropology and have oscillated back and forth. I was initially trained in laboratory genetics, but in the late 90s, circumstances took me out of the lab, so I found other interests in history and what we now call decolonized science. I came here in 2000 and have now been here for 20 years.
So I do have a quick question. What does decolonized science actually mean?
Okay. Well, essentially, biological anthropology is built on the skulls of Native Americans and collecting and treating things as objects, such as people's ancestors. In the 1990s, a growing interest in how materials we work with and how they are being treated became a prominent topic. The breaking point was the Native American Protection Act. This empowered Native Americans to reclaim the values of their ancestors. It mandated that bones and cultural materials that were displayed in museums to not be put up until contacting the tribe that their artifacts came from. It had created a generation gap among biological anthropologists. One of the things I got involved with in the late 90s was Native American activism. These people were being used as scientific objects. Their DNA was being exploited, and there was a huge controversy between the geneticists and the Native American activists. The geneticists told me to fuck off, and we told the geneticists to fuck off. Getting on the wrong side of science alienated me from older representatives of the scientific community. And decolonizing the science is essentially, how do I put it, treating the natives with much more respect than they had in the past. Rather than being pincushions for geneticists or sources of bones for archaeologists, it is an ongoing movement.
That is very respectful on your part. Considering people more like partners rather than test subjects. So for your book, Tale of the X-Apes, what is your overall message? And what were you trying to prove when writing this book?
That's a good question. What I was trying to prove was that when we look at human evolution, we're not doing biology. We're doing something that you need to have a great background in biology. But this is not biology. If you do not understand what is different about it, then you'll never be able to make sense of it, because a lot of what we do involves moral, political, and cultural questions that a training in biology just doesn't prepare you for.
That is true. You talk a lot about biological relatedness, so can you give me a brief rundown of what exactly this means?
Of course. When I say biological relatedness, I just mean the genetics of it. So, you're half genetically related to a parent, while 1/8 related to a cousin. Culturally, for example, even though you're 1/8 related to your cousin, most cultures divide out your cousins in complex ways, such as between cross cousins and parallel cousins. It turns out that in many cultures, your cross cousin is a preferred spouse, which is the most common marriage partner in the world, while your parallel cousin would be considered incestuous. Culturally, people regard those cousins as being completely different, even though they are genetically the same. This is the basis for when anthropologists talk about kinship. This is the culture idea that people have about relatedness, which completely contradicts the biological facts. When I talk about biological relatedness, I'm talking about the genetic relatedness, which is different from kinship and is more important than the biological relatedness. Kinship is cultural because we make relatives, such as through adoption. Culture creates relatives separate from our biological relatedness of relatives. Biologists approach human kinship as strictly genetics, and it's not.
On the topic of relatedness, you claim on page 70 that relatedness is an origin myth. Can you go into more detail about that?
Yeah, of course. Alright, so kinships is who we are. Where do we come from? Everybody's going to tell stories about who they are and where they come from. Why? Because where you come from is your ancestors. We generally do not like to talk about cultural universals because there are very few things we can talk about. But the ancestors are always sacred. relatedness and ancestors are sacred. When you tell stories about where you come from, those stories are always powerful stories. In Game of Thrones, for example, Jon Snow is the bastard of House Stark, and he is reminded of this every episode. Why? Because kinships tell you who you are, where you fit in, tells you if you are legitimate, and it gives you a place in the social sphere. Ancestry is who you are descended from, which is part of relatedness. What I'm trying to say in the book is that science is not immune to this.
Interesting. Okay, so when reading this book, what do you want readers to actually take away?
What I want people to take away is that you can know all of the biology in the world, but it won't explain human ancestry to you. And if you want to understand human ancestry, you need to understand the anthropology, because it includes some information that is biology, sacred, some that contradict. If you approach it as a natural history, you will never make sense of human ancestry. The way anthropology is formatted is that it is the story of ancestors. New species are components of a larger story, and if you think of a new species as a biological thing, it is an unanswerable question. If you think of it as a component of a myth, then it makes sense. It doesn't mean that it isn't real. It just means that it is real as a cultural entity, as part of the story of who we are and not a biological thing.
Do you think people that are not pursuing anthropology can benefit from reading your book?
Yeah, to some biologists it's very threatening though. Some biologists really want to be able to understand the literature of human evolution as if it was a biological literature. There are complaints going all the way back to the 40s when I was a graduate student. I did secretary work for a paleontologist named Simpson. Simpson did this taxonomy of the mammals. When he got to primates, and especially humans, he became increasingly frustrated. He claimed maybe we could just forget about trying to understand humans and leave them out completely. The problem is that the literature on human fossil taxonomy was just so wacko, every fossil got a new name. Simpson found this very frustrating. Since he was an expert on mammalian taxonomy, he should be able to look at human literature and make sense of it. The problem with that is that he wasn't recognizing that when you write about the human taxonomy of extinct mammals, you are not talking about our ancestors. When you talk about your great-great-grandparents, it is a very different story from the ancestors of rats. I think in order to make sense of our own ancestors, you have to understand the context of stories from our ancestors, rather than scientific stories of the mammals. I think the importance of stories tells us more about our ancestry than the biological sense of ancestry.
For anthropologists, how does this book contribute to the understanding of the field?
It's a good question. I think it does summarize and makes a lot of sense of disparate information. Some of it is theoretical, some of it is empirical. For example, one of the chapters contains an image of natural selection, and then cultural selection, and all of these things that are larger. The reasoning behind me doing that is because 50 years ago, give or take, we talked about evolution as changes in allele frequencies. Now we recognize them as extended symphosis. There's much more going on. That non-deductive theoretical outline is put in there for that reason. There's also an understanding of the fossil record. Rather than looking at each species as a biological entity, I try to understand origins at the genus level. The genus level makes much more sense. That is what I have tried to do in the book. Take the focus away from the species and focus on the genus.
Well, Mr. Jonathan Marks, we thank you so much for this amazing discussion. We truly appreciate your time and consideration.